For most of history, economic turning points did not begin with innovation. They began with disorder. As societies grew larger and more connected, the challenge was no longer how to create wealth, but how to keep exchange from slowing under its own complexity. At a certain scale, informal rules stop working, trust becomes expensive, and uncertainty starts shaping behavior long before anyone calls it a problem. China reached that point earlier than most civilizations, not through collapse, but through growth. This video looks at how incentives quietly reshape economies long before results appear, and why one legal decision changed how China's economy functioned for centuries. Early Chinese society expanded rapidly. Population increased, trade networks stretched across regions, work became more specialized, growth created opportunity and friction. Farmers depended on merchants, merchants depended on contracts. Officials depended on predictable revenue. Local customs once governed exchange through memory and reputation. That worked when communities were small. It failed when transactions crossed regions, dialects, and social ranks. Outcomes became inconsistent, disputes multiplied, and every unresolved disagreement raised the cost of doing business. The problem was not dishonesty, it was unpredictability, and unpredictability is expensive. Uncertainty does more than confuse people, it redirects behavior. When outcomes are unclear, people protect themselves. They charge more, they delay decisions, they avoid unfamiliar partners, trade slows even when demand exists. For the state, this mattered deeply. Taxes depended on production, production depended on exchange, and exchange depended on expectations. Uncertainty didn't just slow trade. It redirected it towards safety, familiarity, and avoidance. The system needed coordination, not persuasion, but standardization. The law that changed China's economy was not written to promote fairness. It was written to reduce variance. Clear rules replaced local interpretation. Standard penalties replaced negotiated outcomes. Predictability replaced judgment. This was the turning mechanism. When outcomes become predictable, behavior changes before enforcement ever occurs. Merchants calculate risk differently. Officials act with fewer disputes. Those with scale benefit most because predictability rewards repeat participation. The law worked upstream. It shaped incentives long before punishment was needed. Written law traveled farther than authority. It did not depend on who you knew. It depended on what was recorded. That made it portable, repeatable, scalable. Markets expanded because risk became legible. Revenue stabilized because disputes declined. But scale was achieved by sacrificing local adaptation. Flexibility narrowed quietly. Under stable conditions, this looked like progress. Under stress, it would matter. Uniform rules lowered transaction costs. They also reduced discretion. Judgment gave way to procedure. Procedure favored consistency. At first, the trade-off felt invisible. The system became easier to manage, but harder to adjust. And once rules replace discretion, reversal becomes costly. The law solved uncertainty. It also reshaped incentives. And incentives, once embedded, rarely returned to balance on their own. The law worked, order held, trade expanded. But stability began depending on something fragile, conditions staying familiar. When predictability becomes more valuable than adjustment, the cost of change rises quietly. If this way of explaining how systems actually work resonates with you, this channel is built around that lens. Subscribing means continuing to develop it. What followed was not driven by chaos, but by commitment, and commitment changes how systems respond to stress. Once the legal framework stabilized exchange, growth accelerated. Trade expanded across regions. Revenue became more predictable. Administration grew more confident. But success changed what the system could afford. Expansion stopped being upside. It became baseline. Early on, flexibility allowed pauses, local failure, and correction without threatening the whole system. Markets could slow. Regions could adjust independently. Now, stability mattered more than efficiency, because efficiency could tolerate disruption and stability could not. The system no longer benefited only from movement. It now depended on continuity, even when conditions no longer favored it. That dependency did not appear dangerous. It appeared responsible. Predictability reduced friction. But it also changed how pressure was handled. Instead of releasing strain through adjustment, the system absorbed it. Disputes were resolved faster. Outcomes became uniform. Deviation declined. Stability was increasingly purchased by carrying pressure rather than dispersing it. So the system learned to carry strain quietly, because resolving it quickly now carried higher cost. That pressure did not vanish. It accumulated in margins, in time, and in future capacity. What looked like resilience was often accumulation. As confidence grew, obligations followed, loans expanded, production scaled, expectations hardened. Borrowing was no longer just funding growth, it was maintaining position. Losses did not vanish, they moved inward, and inward losses are harder to pass on. When losses move inward, correction becomes politically and socially costly. Future decisions become tied to past commitments. What had once been a tool for acceleration became a mechanism for exposure. To manage scale, institutions expanded, records multiplied, oversight increased, procedures standardized. The system was not failing, it was becoming heavier. Each layer added weight, friction, and inertia. The system became legible, and legibility came at the cost of flexibility, the very quality needed when conditions shift. Each adjustment made sense in isolation. Together, they narrowed the range of affordable responses. Over time, priorities shifted. The goal was no longer adaptation. It was preservation. Maintenance replaced adjustment. The economy still functioned. Wealth still circulated. But reversing course now carried institutional and social cost. Stability had supporters. Change had consequences. The system optimized for holding its shape. Risk had not increased suddenly. It had become harder to release. Momentum protected the system, but it also trapped it. Confidence began to matter more than correction. The structure rewarded alignment, even as fragility quietly increased. Delayed adjustment does not remove risk. It concentrates it. Each layer built to preserve stability reduced the system's ability to respond cheaply. And once a system is built to avoid disruption, change stops being a tool and becomes the thing the system is designed to resist. From the outside, everything still appeared controlled, but internally, adjustment was becoming expensive and time was no longer neutral. The system was no longer choosing freely. It was protecting what it had already committed to, and time had already begun working against it. As stability became the system's priority, behavior began to change. Nothing was prohibited, nothing was forbidden, but deviations slowly became expensive. Choices were no longer judged only by outcomes, but by how predictable they appeared in advance. Predictable behavior fit the system. Unpredictable behavior introduced friction. So individuals and institutions learned to optimize not for best results, but for lowest variance. This shift did not feel restrictive. It felt prudent. But systems that reward low variance consistently also begin suppressing upside along with downside. What protects against small mistakes often underperforms when conditions change. Fragility accumulates quietly. Judgment adapts to conditions. Rules assume conditions remain similar. As scale increased, judgment became difficult to coordinate. Rules became easier to enforce. Written procedures replaced situational discretion. This improved speed and consistency. It also reduced responsiveness. Lag entered the system quietly, not because information was missing, but because response had become costly. Correction was pushed later, and later corrections are larger. Each delay transferred cost forward in time, where adjustment would eventually demand more sacrifice. Coordination had once been the system's strength. Now it became a dependency. Participation remained possible. But it became conditional. Acting differently was not illegal. It was simply costly. The economy continued functioning, but it functioned best when nothing unexpected happened. As more actors optimized for conformity, deviation became systemically unsafe. Experimentation began selecting itself out. What once enabled cooperation now filtered behavior towards sameness. As flexibility declined, timing changed. The cost of change rose faster than the cost of endurance. Nothing forced the system to stop, and nothing rewarded early adaptation either, so delay became rational. Each postponement felt small. Each carried less immediate cost than action, but every delay shortened the window for cheap correction. What was postponed became harder to reverse later. Patience transformed into future fragility. Rigidity does not distribute cost evenly. Larger actors absorb delay more easily. Smaller ones carry strain sooner. This was not rebellion, it was strain. Pressure shifted toward those least able to absorb it, quietly and unevenly. Risk concentrated, feedback weakened. Early warning signals faded, not because they were absent, but because responding to them had become expensive. The system appeared calm, but calm now depended on continuation. Over time, a reversal took place. Originally, rules were designed to support economic activity. Now economic activity adapted to the rules. Reality adjusted to structure. The system still worked. But it worked within narrowing boundaries. Undoing the reversal now required coordination. Coordination carried political cost, and short-term pain became unavoidable. That is the quiet reversal, and by the time it becomes visible, reversal is no longer cheap. The structures that once made coordination cheap were now making adjustment costly. Pressure was no longer external. It had been internalized. The system still functioned, but only within narrowing limits. Once adaptation becomes more expensive than preservation, systems stop choosing freely. They continue by default. What feels like stability becomes commitment, and commitment, once embedded, reshapes how systems respond when conditions finally refuse to cooperate. By the time pressure becomes visible, the system has already learned how to carry it. By the time stress became visible, the system was no longer choosing freely. Earlier, adjustment had been optional. Corrections could be gradual, limited, and quietly absorbed. Now adjustment required visible loss. This was not denial. It was arithmetic. Any change now meant someone had to absorb cost immediately, in output, in stability, or in credibility. By the time the shift became visible, reversal was no longer cheap or politically tolerable. Stability had been preserved for so long that instability itself became unacceptable. A line had been crossed, quietly. Speed had once been protection. Fast response allowed pressure to dissipate early, before small disruptions could spread. But now speed worked differently. Small disruptions no longer faded locally, they propagated. The system moved faster than it could decide. Pressure traveled more quickly than correction. Reaction always lagged transmission. Momentum no longer absorbed shock, it amplified it. And amplification only moves in one direction. Institutions respond to incentives, not foresight. They had been built to preserve continuity because continuity had delivered results. Metrics still looked strong, processes still functioned. That success masked mismatch. Stability delayed cost, but delay magnified it. Each postponed adjustment grew larger, harder, and more disruptive when it finally arrived. The system worked perfectly for a world that no longer existed. And because the indicators lagged reality, the danger remained invisible while it accumulated. This did not mean the strategy was wrong. Growth had created prosperity. Stability had reduced risk, but success rearranged costs unevenly. Durability protected those already positioned within the system, while magnifying systemic cost when change finally became unavoidable. Flexibility had been exchanged for strength. The system remained powerful, but it lost room to maneuver. Strength without flexibility does not fail quickly. It fails expensively. As interdependence deepened, responsibility diffused. No single actor could adjust alone without bearing more than their share of the cost. First movers paid more than late movers, so everyone waited. Waiting was not negligence. It was the cheapest available response, even as it increased long-term exposure. The system learned to survive without changing, and systems that learn this rarely change early. The turning point was not a moment, it was a condition. Once commitment hardened into structure, even recognizing the problem no longer reduced its cost. Awareness arrived after flexibility was gone. Pressure did not disappear. It moved inward. It accumulated. By the time adjustment felt urgent, the cost of changing direction was already higher than staying on course. The door had not slammed shut, but it no longer opened easily. The lesson is not about China alone. Whenever growth becomes a condition rather than a result, systems trade adaptability for stability. What looks like caution is often structure doing exactly what it was built to do, preserving order in the present while quietly reshaping the future. Seeing this pattern early is often the only leverage that remains. These systems rarely change because of sudden mistakes. They change because success rearranges incentives long before outcomes turn negative. If you're someone who tries to understand change before it becomes obvious, by looking at structure instead of headlines, like the video and subscribe. Not for predictions, but for learning how to recognize turning points while there's still room to respond. That awareness doesn't stop change, but it changes how prepared you are when momentum stops being your ally.